All right, well, good morning, everybody. Glad to see everyone here. I had asked a certain young individual if this morning he was going to let me get through my sermon or if he was going to charge the stage. And he said, I'm going to charge the stage. So be ready, everyone. Be ready. No, it was my intention when I started the story of Absalom to be done on the same day I started. That was my intent. That was what I thought I was going to do. And somehow, as you get involved into the story, you find yourself really wrestling with it. And so this one sermon topic has turned into what will probably end up being 4 or 5. Even last week I said to myself and to David Block, I said, I think I'm done with Absalom. And he said, but I don't know how it ends yet. And I said, yeah, but it's a really long story and there's lots of twists and turns and changes and it's a pretty complicated story. It kind of reminds me of this sign, this traffic sign. Good luck. Good luck getting to where it is you want to go. That's kind of how this story goes. And it actually reminded me of the road trip we just came back from, where even though I had my GPS rolling, but we're in Florida, and even though my GPS is rolling, Florida's roads are not my roads. I grew up in Ohio and I've lived here for the 2 main blocks of traffic that I'm used to. And Florida is different. They will have an exit that will split into 3 exits, and each of those exits will split into 2 exits. And GPS just wasn't helping me. Because I would find myself getting lost, even with GPS, and my wife going, why didn't you turn here? Why didn't you go straight there? I'm like, well, it was really hard to tell. That's kind of how the story of Absalom is, because there's a lot of characters, and they're all kind of related to one another in some way or another, or sometimes they're related to each other twice, which is interesting. I actually grew up, and some friends of mine, their families married each other. And what I mean is they had 2 sisters and a brother that married 2 brothers and a sister. So they had what's called double cousins. And every child looks like they're from the same family. That's kind of how this story is, except theirs is above level, and this one's not so much. In the story of Absalom, we have this cast of characters, which I think we'll talk about more next week. This cast of characters, it's pretty convoluted, actually. So you've got this guy we started with. His name is Amnon. And you may remember that Amnon is the one that abused his sister Tamar. Full sister? I don't know. Half sister? Possibly. Don't know. You have another brother named Absalom, who waits for their father, King David, whom you heard of, to do something about it. King David does nothing. He plots for 2 years and finally has the sheep shearing party, which we've talked about, and all the fun they had. And there his servants kill his brother Amnon, and then he goes on the run. In the mix of all of that is their cousin named Jonadab, who is telling Amnon what he has to do to trick his sister into being alone with him so he can abuse her. In the story we'll read, we'll see mention of King Saul, of different tribes. We'll meet a guy named Hushai. We already saw Ahithophel last week. Ahithophel, as we'll find out, is the grandfather of Bathsheba, who was one of the main counselors to King David. And you have to wonder if he has some sort of ulterior motive for being there. Because King David, after all, had killed his granddaughter's husband. Eventually led to the death of what would have been one of his great-grandchildren. David had raped Bathsheba. And I sense as I read the story that Ahithophel never really got over King David's actions. And he was always there plotting and planning, like Absalom, the demise of King David. So you can see, and I haven't even mentioned most of the characters. There's still a whole lot of other characters that are not mentioned, but you can see how things get a little squirrely as you're reading the story and think, why didn't he cover that in one sermon? Well, I tried to. There's just too much, too many turns, too many times to circle back and hit that other road again because you didn't quite get to where you needed to go. So this morning we're going to do something, it's going to be a little different. I know that normally in a sermon, you will wait for the preacher to say at the end, and here's what you need to know, right? And trust me, as a preacher, we have a lot of fun telling you what it is you need to know. But there is value in just knowing the story. There's value in you just knowing the story, because you may take things out of the story that I didn't see. Because I view things with my perspective and you view it with yours. So I will try and put a little bow on at the end of this sermon, but I'm hoping that you will find several bows of your own just listening to the story. So having said all of that, let's jump right in. 2 Samuel chapter 16. King David is on the run. Absalom has returned to Jerusalem. He's going to establish himself as king. King David doesn't really know what to do. He kind of takes off with some of his men, and they kind of go off into hiding. And on the way, it says, as King David approached Bahurim, a man from the same clan as Saul's family came out from there. Now remember, David supplanted Saul. So you have to imagine whoever this guy is, he's probably not super happy with David, and we will find out that is actually the case. His name was Shimei, son of Gera, and he cursed as he came out. Just what David wanted. My son's trying to kill me. He's trying to take over the kingdom. I'm trying to get away, and you are out here cursing us. He pelted David and all the king's officials with stones, though all the troops and the special guard were on David's right and left. Now, I don't know if you've ever been upset enough and excited enough to not really care about what happens to you next. Have you ever been so into something that you don't care what happens to you next? You're going to do your thing. That is this guy. You have to picture it, David, exiting king of Israel. He's got soldiers on his left, soldiers on his right, and not just average soldiers. And one guy comes out from the tribe of Benjamin, a descendant of Saul, the tribe of Saul, the same tribe as Saul was part of. And he comes out and he's cursing him, he's throwing stones at him, and he's throwing dirt at him. He does not care what happens to him next. He's going to do his thing. As he cursed, Shimei said, get out, you murderer, you scoundrel. The Lord has repaid you for all the blood you shed in the household of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. Not super happy that David had been their king. The Lord has given the kingdom into the hands of your son Absalom. You have come to ruin because you are a murderer. Now, this is just an aside, but oftentimes in life we will run into people who believe that they can tell you exactly what God is doing and why. That is this guy. God is taking the kingdom away from you. He's going to give it to your son because you are a murderer. Of course, he's wrong if you know the story, and even if you don't know the story, you kind of know that King David doesn't end this way, right? You may not know all the details, but you know that this isn't the end of King David. So we know he's not right, but he is so angry. He is so angry, and there's David with all these troops. Wonder what David's going to do to him. Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said to the king, why should this dead dog curse my lord and the king? Let me go over and cut off his head. But the king said, what does this have to do with you, sons of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord said to him, curse David, who can ask, why do you do this? So this might seem, I'm no fan of King David. I'll just put that out there right now. If King David were running for president today, he would not get my vote. But he seems to have a tempered approach to this. Guys throwing stones at him, throwing dirt on his head, cursing him, calling him a scoundrel and a murderer. And King David says, you want to go chop off his head? What if God told him to do this? Then you'd be chopping off the head of someone that God had commanded to do the thing that you're chopping off his head for. I know it's a little circular, right? Don't do it. Leave him alone. David then said to Abishai and all of his officials, my son, my own flesh and blood, is trying to kill me. How much more then this Benjamite? Leave him alone. Let him curse. for the Lord has told him to. It may be that the Lord will look upon my misery and restore to me his covenant blessing instead of his curse today. So David says, I don't really know exactly what's going on because God has promised me this covenant blessing where I'm going to be, me and my descendants will reign on the throne forever and ever. However, it looks like I'm getting kicked off the throne and I've got this guy cursing me that probably God told him to. So maybe if we leave him alone, God will bless me. And he'll let me return to the throne. Maybe, just maybe. And it seems like we got in our hands here a case of humble David. David the humble. But David's story doesn't end here. And eventually Solomon will become king. And then King David will give him this final bit of advice before he dies. And he says, and remember, you have with you Shemaiah, son of Gera, the Benjamite from Bahurim, who called down bitter curses on me the day I went into Mahanaim. When he came down to meet me at the Jordan, I swore to him by the Lord, I will not put you to death by the sword. But now, do not consider him innocent. You're a man of wisdom, talking to Solomon. You're a man of wisdom. You will know what to do to him. Bring his gray head down to the grave in blood. And he does. And for good measure, he takes out Joab too. I remember when I preached several weeks ago on Solomon, someone came up to me and said, I didn't realize Solomon had killed anybody. I thought he was a man of peace. That's what his name means, man of peace. And yet. So before we start to think too highly of King David, after the passage of some time, he decided, okay, well, God obviously blessed me and not cursed me, so he wasn't sent to curse me by God, so therefore go and kill him. I promised that I wouldn't kill him by the sword. But I didn't tell him my son wouldn't. Score for the loophole. So he sends his son to do what he wouldn't do. Not a fan. That's just me. Now we run into Hushai the spy. Hushai the spy is someone who's been serving King David faithfully, has actually gone on the run or was going to go on the run with him. But King David said, well, what good are you going to do me here? Why don't you go back, infiltrate the advisors of Absalom, and send secret messages to me, which he does. We won't actually read this part, but which he does, to let me know what he's up to. So this is where Hushai the spy comes in. It says, meanwhile, Absalom and all the men of Israel came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel was with him. Remember, Ahithophel, grandfather of Bathsheba, grand advisor to the kings. Then Hushai the Archite, David's confidant, went to Absalom and said to him, long live the king! Long live the king! Absalom said to Hushai, so this is the love you show your friend, talking about King David, this is the love you show to my father? If he's your friend, why didn't you go with him? Good question. He better answer well or Absalom might kill him. Hushai said to Absalom, no, the one chosen by the Lord, by these people, and by all the men of Israel, his I will be. Now, Hushai is lying. This is not true at all. And if you're paying attention, you'll notice that Hushai actually takes the Lord's name in vain here. Because he's saying that God, he's serving God and he's doing this for God, and actually he's just doing it for King David. Absalom did the exact same thing, if you remember. Remember he came to his father after his father finally had allowed him to see him, and they came together, and Absalom was kissed by his father, and they had that great family reunion. It was awesome. And he said, actually, I'd made a vow to God back in Hebron that if I was ever allowed to come back here, that I would go back and worship him over there. Which, of course, doesn't make any sense because God's God, God's everywhere. You can worship him here at the sanctuary if you need to. Why do you go back to Hebron? But I want to go back and worship him there. That was the oath that I had made to God. And David said, okay, go ahead and go back. You made an oath to God. I mean, what choice do you have? And he goes back and he proclaims himself king of Israel. Happens quite a bit in this story. It says, no, I'm going to serve you because God has so obviously chosen you. So I'm going to serve you. God chose you. These people chose you. All of Israel has chosen you. Furthermore, whom should I serve? Should I not serve the Son? Just as I served your father, so I will serve you. And he has answered wisely. And this is in the story where we run into Absalom with David's 10 concubines. Remember, as David went on the run, he put his 10 concubines in charge. He said, take care of the palace while I'm gone. I don't really know what's going on with that story, but that's what it says has happened. And Ahithophel says, I know what you should do to those 10 women to really solidify your place in Israel. We're going to pitch a tent up here on the roof. Remember the story? And you're going to abuse all 10 of them for all of Israel to see. And then they'll know that you are for sure the king, because King David would never let that happen. That's like you've gone too far. And so he listens to Ahithophel. That's where this story takes place chronologically. And it says, now in those days the advice of Ahithophel was like that of one who inquires of God. So they listened to him like they would listen to the high priest. The one who inquires of God is the one who has the Urim and the Thummim inside the breastplate. Remember, we talked about that a long time ago. If not, go on YouTube or something, check it out. And he would ask God questions. He would inquire of God, and he'd pull out the stones to see what the stones would say. That's how they treated the advice of this guy. Every single word he said was from God. And if he said to do it, then do it, which makes the next part of the story pretty interesting. Is everybody with me? Yeah. Has anyone come up with your own bow yet to put on top of this sermon? Okay. Ahithophel said to Absalom, let me choose 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David. Now remember, almost every time they would listen to exactly everything he says, and they would say, well, if that's what God told us to do, then that's what we're doing. This time's a little different. He says, let me choose 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David. I would attack him while he was weary and weak. I would strike him with terror, and then all the people with him will flee. I will strike down only the king and bring all the people back to you. The death of the man you seek will mean the return of all. All people will be unharmed. So Ahithophel has a plan, and it's actually a stroke of genius, like all of his plans apparently have been up to this point. He's like, look, there's no reason to kill all those soldiers. You're going to want them to come back and serve you. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take advantage of them when they're weak, when they're tired, and they're going to run, and King David's going to be left alone, and we're going to kill him. And then they'll know for sure that you're king, and they'll say, hey, can we serve under his reign? And you'll say, yes. The more the merrier. And you'll solidify the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, and you'll have more troops. It's going to be awesome. So, at first, this plan seemed good to Absalom and to all the elders of Israel. Of course it would. It's a master plan. But there's a spy, and they don't know he's a spy. So Absalom says, summon also Hushai the Archite, so we can hear what he has to say as well. When Hushai came to him, Absalom said, Ahithophel has given us this advice. Should we do what he says? If not, give us your opinion. Hushai replied to Absalom, the advice Ahithophel has given is not good this time. Of course he's going to say that. He's not there to tell him anything other than what's good for David. But he doesn't know that. Lots of trickery, lots of deceit, lots going on. Remember the roadmap. He says, you know your father and his men. They are fighters. I love how he gets very descriptive with how they are. And as fierce as a wild bear robbed of her cubs. Besides, your father is an experienced fighter. He will not spend the night with the troops. In other words, you're going to descend upon all those troops, and David's not going to be there. You know how he is. He's always hiding out in caves. You remember how he was with King Saul? Hiding out in caves. That's what he does. It's his M.O., baby. He ain't going to be there. Even now, he's in a cave or some other place. If he should attack your troops first, in other words, while you're wandering around looking for King David, his troops are going to see you and they're going to attack you and kill you. Whoever hears about this will say, there has been a slaughter among the troops who follow Absalom. In other words, people are going to hear it and go, I guess Absalom's not our king? Back to King David, I guess? Here he comes. So in other words, they're not going to follow you anymore, Absalom. Don't do this. It's a really, really bad idea. It says, then even the bravest soldier, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will melt with fear. For all Israel knows that your father is a fighter and that those with him are brave. So in other words, don't do it. Don't listen to Ahithophel. I know he's never let you down a single time before in your life or in David's life, but that's okay. I know his very words are like the words of God, but that's all right. Listen to me. And he does. And Hushai wins. Hushai the spy. It's kind of like Bill Nye the science guy. That's why I picked that. Hushai the spy. He wins. And this begins the end of Absalom. Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the advice of Hushai the Archite is better than that of Ahithophel. Now, it should be noted, which I don't have here, Ahithophel hears that not going to follow his advice. He goes home, he gets his house in order, and he kills himself. Because King David's not going to kill him. He'll end things on his terms and his way. He's not going to let the man that murdered his granddaughter's husband and was responsible for the death of his great-grandchild to be the one to take him out too. His plan has failed. And he goes out on his own terms. And it says, the author gives us an explanation of why they listened to Hushai the Archite instead of Ahithophel. It says, for the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel. His plan was awesome. And had they listened to him, they would have won. But the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. And so David amasses his army. I know this is one of those stories like, will this story ever end? Nope. Because it flows from this story onto the next. You may have noticed that this story is connected to the King Saul story. And when you read beyond the chapters we're going to read, you'll find it's connected to future stories. So there really isn't an end per se. Anyway, back to what we're talking about. David amasses his army. He starts gathering his troops, and they're preparing for war. It says, David mustered the men who were with him and appointed over them commanders of thousands, commanders of hundreds. David sent out his troops, a third under the command of Joab, a third under Joab's brother Abishai, son of Zeruiah, and the third under Ittai the Gittite. The king told the troops, I myself will surely march out with you. In other words, he was going to be there. That was his plan all along, not to hide out in a cave. He was going to be there. But the men said, you must not go out. If we are forced to flee, they won't care about us. In other words, they know Absalom's men are not interested in killing David's men. They have no interest in it. They do have a vested interest in killing David. But his men, be better if they'd all just ran away. They don't care. So they don't care about us. Even if half of us die, they won't care. But you are worth 10,000 of us. It would be better for now. It would be better now for you to give us support from the city. The king answered, I will do whatever seems best to you. So the king stood beside the gate while all his men marched out in units of hundreds and of thousands. The king commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake. So Absalom has one goal, that's kill David. But David has one goal, and that's not to kill Absalom. Because that's his son. Again, I'm no fan of David, but David doesn't want to kill his own children. He says, please, just leave him alone. Don't kill him. And all the troops heard the king giving orders concerning Absalom to each of the commanders. So they know exactly what David wants. He wants his son to live. And they all hear it, and they all know it, and this is pretty important coming up. David's army marched out of the city to fight Israel, and the battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. There Israel's troops were routed by David's men, and the casualties that day were great, 20,000 men. The battle spread out over the whole countryside, and the forest swallowed up more men that day than the sword. In other words, a lot of people just took off running, and they got lost. They didn't know where they were, and they died in that forest. It says more men died running away in fear than were killed by the sword. And this is where Absalom meets his end. And oddly, this is the part of the story that was brought up to me to say, hey, you should preach on this. This is the impetus. This is why we're even doing Absalom at all, because of this part of the story. It only took us just a little tiny bit to get here. Now Absalom happened to meet David's men. He was riding his mule, and as he went, the mule went under the thick branches of a large oak. Absalom's hair got caught in the tree. Now, you might have been wondering this whole time, if we keep looking at this image in the background, you might have been thinking this whole time, what is that image about? Why does he keep bringing up this image and never talking about it? I'd like to say I planned it that way, but again, I plan to use this image in one sermon only. This is why. Because Absalom's men, they've run, and Absalom's on his mule, probably riding around hoping he doesn't get killed. And wouldn't you know it, that long 5 pounds of hair. Remember last week I talked about how good looking Absalom was? How the Bible says he was good looking from head to toe, baby. He's one good looking guy. From the crown of his head to the soles of his feet, there was not a blemish on him. And that was a sign of God's blessing upon him. And this long hair, apparently he needed a trim. Because he got stuck in the branches of a tree, and his mule just kept on going. And there he is, hanging from a tree by his hair. So he was left hanging in midair, while the mule he was riding kept on going. It's an interesting passage from Deuteronomy. You know it probably because of Paul. And he quotes it in the New Testament. He's talking about anyone who hangs on a tree is cursed, and how Jesus overcomes that curse by coming back to life. But originally it was anyone who is hanging from a tree is accursed by God. It says, if someone guilty of a capital offense is put to death and their body is exposed on a tree, now this could mean impaled, by the way, not necessarily hanging from your hair. You must not leave the body hanging on the tree overnight. Be sure to bury it that same day, because anyone who is hung on a tree is under God's curse. So the very sign from the crown of his head that God was blessing him becomes the very thing that ends up cursing him. It says, when one of the men saw what had happened, he told Joab, I just saw Absalom hanging in an oak tree. Joab said to the man who had told him this, what? You saw him? Why didn't you strike him through or strike him to the ground right there? I would have happily given you 4 ounces of silver and a warrior's belt. In other words, I would have given you an award, man. Why'd you leave him alive? But the man replied, even if 400 ounces were weighed out into my hands, I would not lay a hand on the king's son. In our hearing, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, protect the young man Absalom for my sake. Now, what are you talking about? You know we're supposed to leave him alive. And if I had put my life in jeopardy, in other words, if I had killed him and nothing is hidden from the king, you would have kept your distance from me. In other words, let's just say I had done it. Let's just say I saw him and I thought, you know what? David doesn't really know what's good for him. I'm going to kill Absalom right here and now. Do you don't think he wouldn't have heard about that? You think it would have been like, well, who killed him? Well, nobody knows who killed him, David. He would have found out. And where would you have been? Would you have come and said, hey, don't harm him, he did the right thing? No, you would have left me to die, Joab. So no, thank you, but no. He's been paying attention to the cast of characters around him, and he knows that none of them are trustworthy. No, I'm just doing what I'm told to do. So I left him alive. Thank you very much. Joab said, I'm not going to wait like this for you. So he took 3 javelins in his hand and plunged them into Absalom's heart while Absalom was still alive in the oak tree. And 10 of Joab's armor bearers surrounded Absalom, struck him, and killed him. Then Joab sounded the trumpet, and the troops stopped pursuing Israel, for Joab halted them. They took Absalom, threw him into a big pit in the forest, and piled up a large heap of rocks over him. Meanwhile, all the Israelites fled to their homes. Then there's the race to tell David. I told you the story is like, it's the never-ending story, part 1, 2, 3, and 4. You may have heard this story about the guy that outran the Cushite. Ahmaz outran the Cushite to tell David, and Joab's like, why do you want to go tell David that his son is dead? That's like not the news you want to be delivering. Why do you want to go so bad? He's like, I want to go. Like, well, the Cushite already took off. I'm faster than him. And he takes off running. He goes and tells David what had happened, except he doesn't tell him that Absalom's dead. Because David says, okay, that's great. Yeah, we won the war, whatever. Is Absalom okay? And he says, I don't really know. There was a lot of confusion, as you might well imagine, so I don't really know what happened to him. He does, but he doesn't want to say it. And then they see another runner, the Cushite, coming in behind him, and David says, okay, there's 2 runners. This has got to be really good news. He goes, hey, David, we won the war. He's like, yeah, I heard that from the other guy. How's Absalom? Is he alive? And he says, well, let's just read it. The king asked the Cushite, is the young man Absalom safe? The Cushite replied, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up to harm you be like that young man. That is a round-the-bush way of saying, your son is dead. He didn't make it. The king was shaken. He went up to the room over the gateway and wept. As he went, he said, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom. If only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. Again, I'll say it for the 3rd time. I'm not a fan of King David, but I feel this. I feel this. Because there's nothing I wouldn't want to do for my kids. There's nothing I wouldn't want to do. And as much as I look at King David's life and I think, this guy was a scoundrel, this guy was a murderer, I'm kind of with Shimei on this one. He'd done a lot of bad things. He never lost his love for his kids, even when they were acting like Absalom. So, what lessons shall we learn? I know what you're thinking. Good luck, Rob. Well, I came up with a really good first lesson I think super important. Greg's going to agree with me on this. Chris is going to agree. Ron, you're going to agree. It's good to be bald. Well, I know you got it. It's good to be bald. No, but on a serious note, sometimes the things we start out with good intentions end with us having bad intentions. Sometimes we start off the race and we're running well. We're doing it right. We start to get tugged this way and that way. Start listening to this person and that person. And before we know it, the very thing that was supposed to be a blessing ends up turning around and biting us. Because we lost focus of what we're really trying to do. I mean, just look at Absalom. I know we focused on this last week, but just look at his life. This whole thing started because he knew his dad was being unjust. that he allowed his son Amnon to live for 2 years. And actually, he would have lived until he probably had a natural death if Absalom hadn't done something. And for 2 years, Absalom wonders, is my dad going to ever do anything? And he doesn't. So he takes matters into his own hands. And then when people want to come to David and ask for advice or counsel, or for him to make a judgment call regarding a case, or they need justice performed, and he stands outside the city gate and he stops all of them. It's not just because he was power hungry. That's later. At that moment, it's because he knows his dad's not a just guy. How is he going to issue out justice when he himself is not just? And so he stops him. Oh, I should be judge. And he wins over their hearts. It started out as a good thing, and it ended with him becoming that very thing that he hated. The thing he hated most about his dad, he had become that thing. And that's how it is in life. We try so desperately to become different than the thing that we hate that if we're not careful, we become that thing. We become that very thing. And it's easy to do when we're not careful. So next week, I want to take a look at the cast of characters and all the voices and all of the advice that's given. Because we all have a lot of voices we can listen to. In our own lives, we have situations where we want to do it right. We don't want to do things wrong. We want to do it right. And yet, if we're not careful, we could listen to Hushai instead of Ahithophel. Or listen to Jonadab instead of Absalom. And get it all wrong. So that'll be next week. Be sure to bring your friends. Amen? Amen.